Have you ever wondered how the United States conquered the world without firing a single shot? Not with tanks. Not with fleets. Not by planting flags on distant beaches. But with a quiet, almost ridiculous weapon, a piece of paper, printed in green ink, that the rest of the planet voluntarily agreed to treat as reality. The dollar did not become powerful because it was beautiful, or because it was morally superior. It became powerful because it was engineered to sit inside every transaction, every debt contract, every shipment of oil, every emergency bailout, every moment of panic. That is the secret war. And like every war, it has a front line. It just doesn't look like one. The battlefield is a ledger. The artillery is interest rates. The siege weapon is a sanctions regime that can lock a country out of global trade without firing a bullet. The casualties are measured in collapsed currencies, unaffordable imports, and governments that fall when capital flees overnight. In the 20th century, cannons took cities. In the 21st century, spreadsheets do. Most people are taught the story of American power as if it were a story of armies, diplomacy, or innovation. Those things mattered, but they did not make America's money the language the world uses to buy food, fuel, and survival. The dollar became king through something colder than conquest. Contracts, credit, and promises written in ink instead of blood. Before this era, global power spoke in gold, and in the British pound, London once sat at the heart of finance, with trade settled in sterling and backed by metal that governments could not simply print. That discipline made empires stable. It also became a cage when war costs exploded beyond what treasuries could bear. And then the old world caught fire. When nations abandoned the restraints that kept their currencies honest, the financial center began to shift. And across the Atlantic, the United States did something more decisive than taking territory. It positioned itself as the banker, the supplier, the creditor. It learned that if you control the credit, you control the rebuild. If you control the rebuild, you control the future. Tonight, we're going to trace how that happened. Step by step. From gold to paper, from London to Wall Street. From a world of empires to an empire made of trust. And we're going to confront the question that sits underneath everything. What happens when the world stops believing? To understand how the dollar rose, you have to understand what it replaced. Before America's money ruled the world, power lived inside restraint. The gold standard forced governments to obey a simple rule. You could only spend what your gold reserves allowed. If gold left your vaults, your power shrank. If confidence broke, currencies collapsed quickly and visibly. Empires lived under discipline, and that discipline shaped their behavior. For more than a century, Britain mastered that system. The pound sterling was trusted not because Britain was kind, but because it was predictable. Trade from India to South America settled in pounds, convertible into gold on demand. London became the clearinghouse of the world. The system worked until it met something it could not survive. Industrial war. The First World War shattered the old mechanism. Modern war consumed money faster than gold could be mined or moved. Governments faced an impossible choice. Lose the war or break the rules. One by one, they suspended convertibility. Britain did it. France did it. Germany did it. The moment gold discipline disappeared, the old hierarchy cracked. This is where the hidden mechanism emerges. When restraint dies, credit replaces it. And credit is power only if someone trusts you to repay it. Across the Atlantic, the United States was in a unique position. Its factories were intact. Its population was untouched by bombing. Its vaults were filling with gold as Europe paid for food, weapons, and fuel. America did not need to conquer land. It needed to become indispensable. By lending dollars instead of demanding territory, the United States rewired the system. European nations did not just owe money. They owed time, policy, flexibility, and future obedience to the creditor. Debt quietly replaced empire. This is the moment money stopped being a neutral medium and became a lever. After the war, the mechanism deepened. Europe needed reconstruction. Reconstruction required capital. Capital came from Wall Street. Dollars flowed outward, not as charity, but as architecture. Loans were structured so that repayment reinforced American financial dominance. The more countries borrowed, the more they needed dollars to function. The more they needed dollars, the more power Washington gained without issuing commands. This is the key insight most people miss. The dollar did not dominate because America forced the world to use it. The world chose it because the system left no alternative that was as liquid, as trusted, or as scalable. Power did not arrive through violence. It arrived through dependence. And once dependence exists, it does not need to be announced. It enforces itself. Once the mechanism was in place, the next step was consolidation. Power does not live in abstractions. It lives in institutions, incentives, and the people who control access. At the center of the dollar system sits the United States Treasury, not as a simple government department, but as the issuer of the asset the world treats as safest when fear arrives. Treasury bonds are not just debt. They are collateral for the global financial system. Banks use them. Governments hoard them. Markets price risk around them. When confidence cracks anywhere, capital does not scatter randomly. It runs toward American debt. Supporting the Treasury is the Federal Reserve, the most influential central bank in history. The Fed does not merely set domestic interest rates. It sets the tempo of global liquidity. When it loosens policy, dollars flood outward, fueling growth, speculation, and leverage across continents. When it tightens, dollars vanish from the periphery, pulling capital back toward the center. Entire economies live and die by these cycles, even if they never voted for the policymakers who trigger them. Then there is Wall Street. Banks, hedge funds, rating agencies, and clearing institutions form the nervous system of the empire. They decide which countries are investable, which debts are credible, and which risks are acceptable. A downgrade on a screen can raise borrowing costs faster than a lost battle ever could. Access to capital becomes a privilege, not a right. Outside the core, the rest of the world organizes itself around survival. Export nations must earn dollars. Import-dependent nations must borrow them. Energy producers price oil in them. Developing economies build reserves in them, not because they want to, but because they cannot afford not to. Even rivals of the United States hold the currency of their competitor, because abandoning it would destabilize themselves first. This map reveals the real hierarchy. Military power enforces borders. Financial power enforces behavior. Countries may oppose Washington rhetorically, but their balance sheets often tell a different story. They maneuver carefully, knowing that crossing certain lines risks exclusion from the system that feeds their economies. That is the quiet genius of the dollar empire. No governor rules the whole structure. No single law enforces obedience. The incentives align themselves. Those at the center gain flexibility. Those at the edges absorb volatility. And the system reproduces its own dominance simply by functioning. This is not conspiracy. It is architecture. And once built, it is extraordinarily difficult to dismantle. Once the power map is in place, the system begins to move on its own. And when it moves, it does not move gently. The first reaction happens through trade. Because commodities are priced in dollars, every country must either earn dollars by exporting or borrow them to import what it cannot produce. This creates a constant gravitational pull toward the American currency. A nation can dislike the system and still be trapped inside it, because refusing dollars means refusing trade itself. The second reaction flows through debt. When countries borrow in dollars, they accept a risk that does not appear on the surface. Their revenues are in local currency, but their obligations are not. When the dollar strengthens, repayment becomes more expensive overnight. Budgets strain. Social spending shrinks. Political pressure rises. The crisis looks domestic, but the trigger is external. Then comes the interest rate channel. When the Federal Reserve raises rates, global capital shifts instantly. Investors pull money out of emerging markets and rush towards safer returns in U.S. assets. Local currencies weaken. Inflation spikes through higher import costs. Central banks abroad face a brutal choice: raise rates and choke growth, or hold steady and risk collapse. Either way, the pain is absorbed far from Washington. Financial crises accelerate this pattern. A shock in Asia, Latin America, or Eastern Europe does not weaken the dollar. It strengthens it. Panic drives investors toward liquidity, and nothing is more liquid than U.S. Treasuries. Each collapse on the periphery tightens the system around the center. The empire feeds on instability without needing to create it deliberately. Sanctions add another layer. Because dollar transactions clear through U.S.-linked systems, access can be revoked. Banks can be isolated. Reserves can be frozen. Trade can halt in days. What once required blockades now requires compliance from payment networks. Economic warfare becomes precise, deniable, and devastatingly effective. The final reaction is psychological. Governments plan their policies around avoiding punishment rather than pursuing independence. Corporations hedge dollar exposure instead of investing long-term. Populations experience austerity without understanding the chain that led there. The system disciplines behavior quietly, through incentives rather than orders. This is how financial power replaces territorial control. No occupation force is needed. The rules of the game enforce themselves. And as long as the dollar remains the exit everyone runs toward in a crisis, the chain reaction never truly ends. No system built on trust escapes its moment of stress. And for the dollar empire, that moment arrived not from foreign enemies, but from its own success. By the late 1960s, the United States was doing something no previous financial hegemon had dared to sustain for long. It was running enormous deficits while promising the world that every dollar could still be exchanged for gold. Washington was fighting a costly war in Vietnam, expanding social programs at home, and exporting dollars at a pace that far exceeded the gold sitting in its vaults. Foreign governments noticed. They did the math, and quietly, they began to test the promise. France, under Charles de Gaulle, openly questioned the fairness of a system where America could pay for real goods with paper that others had to earn. Other nations followed more discreetly. Dollars flowed back to the United States, not for trade, but for redemption. Gold reserves started to drain. The illusion of infinite stability began to crack. This was the breaking point every empire faces. Either restore discipline and accept contraction, or change the rules and preserve dominance. On an August night in 1971, President Richard Nixon chose the second option. With a short television address, he closed the gold window. The dollar would no longer be convertible into anything tangible. It became pure fiat, backed not by metal, but by confidence and necessity. By historical standards, this should have ended the empire. Every previous power that debased its currency eventually collapsed. Rome diluted silver. Spain flooded Europe with New World bullion. Britain overstretched sterling. History was unforgiving. But America survived because the world had already been rewired. Trade still needed dollars. Debt was still denominated in dollars. There was no alternative system large enough, liquid enough, or trusted enough to replace it overnight. The dollar did not fall because it was no longer a promise of gold. It rose because it had become the infrastructure itself. That moment transformed the empire. What had once been invisible became permanent. The dollar no longer needed backing. It needed belief. And belief, once embedded into global survival, is far harder to withdraw than gold. The breaking point passed. But it left behind a system that now depended entirely on confidence, not restraint. And that trade-off would shape everything that followed. After the gold link was severed, the dollar should have drifted into uncertainty. Instead, it found a new anchor, one far more powerful than metal: energy. In the mid-1970s, the United States quietly secured an agreement with Saudi Arabia that reshaped the global economy. Oil would be priced exclusively in dollars, and in return, Washington would guarantee the kingdom's security. Other producers followed. The result was not just a petrodollar system, but a universal requirement. Every nation needed energy. Every nation therefore needed dollars. This transformed the dollar from a medium of exchange into a condition of modern life. To power factories, transport goods, and heat cities, countries had to participate in the dollar system. Reserves piled up in central banks. Treasury bonds became the default store of safety. American deficits were no longer a weakness. They were a service the world depended on. Over time, the consequences deepened. The Federal Reserve became the de facto central bank of the world. Its decisions rippled outward, shaping growth cycles far beyond U.S. borders. Wall Street absorbed global capital, concentrating financial influence in a way no empire ever had geographically. Crises reinforced the structure. Latin America in the 1980s. Asia in the 1990s. The global crash of 2008. Each time, capital fled toward the dollar. Each time, the system emerged stronger. Even mistakes made at the center increased dependence at the edges. This created a paradox. The United States could destabilize the world and still be rewarded with more power. Fear did not weaken the empire. It fed it. Trust in the dollar outweighed resentment toward it. Yet the long-term cost became visible. Mounting debt, financialization over production, political polarization at home. The privilege to print without immediate consequence encouraged excess. The empire survived, not because it was flawless, but because no alternative seemed safe enough to replace it. This is the legacy of dollar dominance. A system that stabilizes global trade while exporting volatility. A hierarchy where sovereignty is constrained by balance sheets. And an empire that rules not through occupation, but through dependence so deep that escape appears more dangerous than submission. Every empire believes its system is different. Every ruling currency convinces itself that history has finally been conquered. The dollar feels eternal not because it is perfect, but because it is embedded everywhere. In contracts, in commodities, in savings, in fear itself. Nations do not just use the dollar. They plan their futures around it. And that is what makes this financial empire so subtle and so dangerous. When power is invisible, it is rarely questioned. But history offers a warning that no privilege escapes forever. Spain trusted silver. Britain trusted sterling. Rome trusted the illusion that dilution would never matter. Each believed confidence could be managed indefinitely. Each learned, too late, that trust is not a resource you can mine or print. It exists only as long as people choose to believe. The same paradox now confronts the dollar. The very power that allows the United States to borrow without limit also tempts it toward overreach. Rising debt, political fracture, inflationary pressure, and strategic rivals testing alternatives do not end empires overnight. They erode them quietly. Through workarounds, through regional systems, through doubts that accumulate long before collapse arrives. If the dollar ever loses its throne, it will not be through a dramatic crash. It will fade through slow fragmentation, a little less trade here, a little less trust there, until one day, the system no longer feels inevitable. So what does this secret war mean for you? It means understanding that money is not neutral. It is power while it is believed. It means recognizing that every crisis, every rescue, every promise of stability follows the same pattern. Create credit, delay the cost, shift the burden forward. And it means remembering that real resilience does not live in numbers on a screen, but in skills, production, knowledge, and adaptability. The greatest empire in history was not built on land or kings, but on confidence. And confidence, once confused with truth, has a habit of humbling even the most powerful. If this story changed how you see money, power, and the world you live in, take a moment to subscribe. Because the wars that matter most today are not fought with weapons, but with belief.